I want to thank everyone who came. I've been really touched by all the comments that I've gotten over the course of these 2 months from people who came to see the show, and I really appreciate your empathy. And this show, my art show, was a tribute to my aunt who was in the Minidoka concentration camp, and she never had a voice. She couldn't talk about her time. And so the show, to me, was her voice finally getting to speak her story. And we're extending that by, I've invited 3 prominent Japanese American leaders to speak about the topic of the internment, the injustice of it, how it affected us as descendants, and in Sam's case, survivor of a camp, and what it means in terms of why our story is relevant today in terms of the immigrant detentions. So first of all, I want to thank the museum and Dalia Garcia, the director. This museum is pretty amazing. It's got a woman of color as the director, which is not common in the art world, and they're doing some amazing things in that they are providing a place for art that sometimes doesn't hit the mainstream museums. I went to art school and studied art, and it was pretty much based on European art and white American art. We didn't even touch Asian art or African art or Islamic art or any of the other traditions that have been around for thousands of years. So I think this museum is trying to change that a bit, and I'm really grateful. It's hard as an artist right now because there aren't a lot of places that feel free to do anything that even has a hint of diversity, equity, inclusion, because we have an administration that is against that. He's even gone after the venerable Smithsonian, calling them political activists because they want to show slavery as it was, not any whitewashed version. So I really thank the museum for this opportunity. And I'm going to introduce each one of these gentlemen individually, more formally. But first, I just want to say this is Sam Mihara, Wade Nomura, and Mark Masaoka. And just to say that, there's a couple of different ways to approach the discussion of the camps. One is personal, how people were affected personally by that experience. And intertwined with that is also the cultural and societal implications of what happened. How did we live in a democracy based on a constitution when over 220,000 Japanese Americans were put behind barbed wire, when over half of them were American citizens who were supposed to be granted the right of habeas corpus per the Constitution and were never allowed to speak up for themselves in court. And why only Japanese Americans and not the Italians and the Germans? And why just 3 states, California, Oregon, Washington, leading to really some strange things that happened. A woman who came to the show talked about how her parents had grown up had lived in Utah, free during the war, and very close to them was one of the concentration camps where 8,000 Japanese Americans were held under guard. So it's a very odd disparity that we'll discuss among many other things. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a more formal introduction of our 3 speakers. To my left is Sam Mihara. He's an award-winning lecturer on the history of mass injustice perpetrated on the Japanese Americans during World War II. His awards include the Biennium Award for Education and Humanities from the Japanese American Citizens League, and the prestigious Paul Gagnon Prize as a History Educator of the Year from the National Council for History Education, the first time for a Japanese American. His speaking engagements, and if you look at his website, there are dozens, if not hundreds, have included lectures at the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Congress, Harvard, UC Berkeley, and Columbia Law School. I'm going to introduce the other 2 gentlemen after Sam gives us a small or brief sort of overview of his very illustrious career and his life as a survivor of a concentration camp.
Well, thank you very much, Tomo. I thought I'd give you a very brief summary of what happened and why it happened. In particular, why only Japanese and not Italians and Germans. Back in February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order called 9066. That order gave the authority to remove people to the military. And he signed it. It doesn't say Japanese or Germans or Italians. It simply said, I give the authority to remove people to the military. So who were the military at that time in charge? Well, in the U.S., there were major districts, 5 major districts, military districts. East Coast, Central, Southern, West Coast, and Hawaii. 4 out of the 5 generals said, no, it doesn't make sense. There's no evidence these people have done anything wrong. So why put them away? We need workers during the war. We can't have them put away in a prison. So most of the people in the other states outside of the West Coast got to stay put. So there were Japanese in Colorado and Utah and Illinois. They all got to stay put. But there's one general in charge of the West Coast. His name was Lieutenant General John DeWitt. He hated Japanese. And it turns out in his career, he's been fighting Japanese most of his career, so it was not a surprise when he was given the authority. He decided to remove people of Japanese ancestry from Washington, Oregon, and California. He gave us 1 week. You have 1 week to get rid of your possessions, your property, and get on a bus to take you to prison. And then that was it. So we had to have one hand carry, and we went to our prison in northern Wyoming. I went to one called Heart Mountain. Terrible place. But I'm not going to go into details on that yet, but I'll simply say that it was due to this one general who made the decision that it was my choice. I want you people to go. And that's why 120,000 of us went to the camp.
Okay, thank you. And second, we have Wade Nomura, as you might know him as being a Carpinteria councilman and 2-time mayor. He was born and raised in Santa Barbara. His parents settled here after their release from the Poston, Arizona concentration camp. He is the president of the Santa Barbara Japanese American Citizens League and author of Creating Destiny, about his early life as a Japanese American after World War II. He's also an international speaker and project coordinator for the Rotary Foundation, having worked on over 50 international project missions, ranging from an ambulance project in southern Chile to a large-scale water project in Michoacan, Mexico, and also in Haiti.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. So reflections I have, no, I'm not 100 years old. I was not around when the camps actually were open and running. I did get a lot of information from my parents as much as I could, because that was one of the topics they didn't want to talk about, but we spent time asking a lot of questions about that one. Both of my parents, my grandparents were interned in Poston, Arizona. My father's side was actually the Ranella growers in the Imperial Valley. My mother's side were in produce and actually had 2 restaurants in San Luis Obispo. So they spent 4 years there, and as you heard, part of the trouble is that they were given very short time. They were told that you can only take what you can carry with you. Everything else you had to leave behind. It included also possessions that they owned. They did not have time to store anything like that. And if they did, from where most people are, all those were done anyways. So you could imagine, give it 1 week's time to load up a suitcase, saying that for being told that everything else you have will be taken care of, finding out afterward and everything had disappeared. So we literally, that's all that you should have, including properties. So that made it tough. What I found most interesting about the times was growing up in Santa Barbara. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara. The reason why we had so many Japanese in the Santa Barbara area, by the way, is because when the camp shut down, they had to immediately evacuate those. And there were very few places to go. Santa Barbara was one of the safe aids because there was a Chinatown that was right next to the old Japanese town. And so what happened then is when they came back, the Chinese had watched over that area. They give it back to the Japanese people. So that's why so many Japanese came here, started in Santa Barbara in this area. That's why my grandparents came here. They had never been here before that time. Looking at the history part of it, the components of history and the stories that were told by the books, by the textbooks. In 7th grade, I took American history. And at that time, we had a teacher, and she goes, okay, now, who do you know or do you know anybody that was ever put in the concentration? So I raised my hand. She was, yes. Who was it? She gave me kind of a funny look. I says, oh, my mother and father, my grandparents, uncles and aunts all went to camp. She goes, you know, I would have to give you a week's worth of detention for lying. And the reason for that is because it doesn't show up anymore in the history book. When I teach American history, I've taught without an entire country, and never once have I seen anything written in the history books in U.S. history about that parody. So, went my first night to detention. As I was sitting in there, the vice principal came up, tapped me on the shoulder, goes, Wade, there's been a mistake, please go. What I found out was that teacher came from Chicago. He had never experienced anything on the West Coast. And then I looked at it. She was true. There was not a single, even sentence talking about the internment of Japanese Americans in that book. After that time, one of the reasons why I think it's important that we hear about this is that we make sure that there's no repeating of history like this. So I think that's why it's important to have conversations like this one. With that, I do have some other interesting stories for you, but I'll share those during a time of question and answer, or I'd be happy to stick on after this for anything else.
Last but not least, we have Mark Masaoka. He's been a leader in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, working for housing for residents displaced by redevelopment, and as policy director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, the director of strategic initiatives for the Los Angeles County Children's Planning Council, as well as helping found the Little Tokyo Community Impact Fund, which collects small investment shares to purchase real estate and enables local ethnic legacy businesses to stay in business. He is part of Nikkei Progressive's current collaborative work on immigrant rights and Black reparations. Mark was a union auto worker and elected UAW officer. He was also active in the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations that led to the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that granted reparations to Japanese Americans who had been unjustly incarcerated by the government, and to the formal apology by President George W. Bush. His father, Tab, was active in the wartime Japanese American Citizens League and served with 4 brothers in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me here. My mother was incarcerated in Topaz, Utah, and my father was at Manzanar. And after the riots that took place there, partly because my father's family was associated with the Japanese American Citizens League, the riots led him to be evacuated to Death Valley, after which he volunteered and served in the 442nd, the all-Japanese combat team that received proportionally, the most decorated group within the U.S. military. Although the ratio of injured to deaths was much higher, because soldiers, as my father said, he would see at times where 2 soldiers would go out and get injured, saving a third soldier. And he said another battles, it was too costly for them to attempt actions like that. Mike was involved for that. My Uncle Joe was also. Joe went to Heart Mountain, where he tried to persuade the 63 draft resistors. These were Japanese American Nisei citizens who refused to draft while their families were in prison. And they spent the rest of the time in a federal penitentiary. And my uncle was trying to persuade them to win this, but those were the kind of reactions that different people had. Others refused to, who were not eligible for the draft, but refused to express loyalty in the questionnaires. They were sent segregated in the camp at Dewey Lake. After the war, my father was able to go to college on the GI Bill and eventually buy a house. But he noticed that most black vets were not able to do that because the GI Bill was administered by individual states. So if your state didn't want you to buy a house, you didn't buy a house. And if you couldn't get a loan from a bank, you weren't able to, you couldn't get a loan through the GI Bill. So these are some of the patterns of the discrimination that we noticed that, a lot of Japanese American veterans remember. And then after the war, in the Bay Area, my father, he moved us back because he wasn't able to get work after the war in California. So he moved us back to Washington, D.C., where he worked for his brother Mike with the JACL and the civil rights book they were doing. When things started to open up, he moved us back to California, but he wanted us to move into places in San Mateo. But those areas were off limits to all persons of color. So we couldn't move there, and this was 1960, so we were not able to move there until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and then we were able to move there. So these kinds of instances of discrimination remained very persuasive. And they fought a Proposition 14 in 1963, which affirmed the legalization that you could discriminate on the basis of race and discriminate on the basis of race in both employment and in housing, real estate. And that law that was passed by the voters of California was only overturned after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. So I think the next thing is, for the, following the camps, there was a very great reluctance, as I mentioned, of people not even wanting to talk about it, no pressure to put it in the schools. And so I think as people my generation were coming out of ethnic studies classes, people were learning about what happened. They were learning about social problems that were in our communities, and people were coming out of fighting gentrification in some of the Japantown here in California, in San Francisco, and San Jose, and Los Angeles. So in the late 70s, it was clear that the EC generation, our grandparents, my grandparents' generation, were passing away. People knew it was time to act. And so people formed various coalitions that built a big grassroots movement. There was 140 people went to Washington, D.C. to lobby for it. And along with some fortunate circumstances, it was passed. And in 1988, and Congress passed and President Reagan signed a bill that gave Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated $20,000 in reparations, along with an apology and an educational fund. So I think that experience of being successful in raising these issues and the support we got from a lot of other communities, including the Congressional Black Caucus, set the stage for us to be feeling like we did not want this, and as others have mentioned, we did not want this kind of oppression to happen in any other people. And so when for example, in 2001, after 9/11, there was I think a lot of anti-Muslim, anti-Arab rage, and I think some of us for the first time began to feel like we understood what our parents had gone through, hearing all the hatred over the airwaves. And significant that I think the Secretary of Transportation for George Bush was Norman Mineta, a Japanese American, who persuaded President Bush not to do racial profiling against Muslim and Arab Americans. Then later on, I think we became involved in the Black reparations movement because of similar kinds of justification. And so when the Congressional Black Caucus had hearings with the House Judiciary Committee, the only non-black speaker that they invited to speak was a member of our Nikkei Progressives in Los Angeles, was a Japanese American who spoke. And on the California State Commission on Reparations, there was only one non-black on that commission, and that was attorney Don Giamatti for San Francisco and the Asian Law Caucus there. And then most recently, I think we have the cases of the immigration raids. And it recalls what happened here in the Santa Barbara County during the war, when in the first weeks after Pearl Harbor, 140 Japanese American men were rounded up and without any notice, no orders, they were picked up, had their homes or from their cars, and whisked off to families did not know where. And that was under the Alien Enemies Act of 1797, which was the same act that President Trump used to justify the immediate seizures of immigrants in this last round that we saw. But the example of what happened in Santa Barbara County also led to the disappearance of a number of small Japan towns that had been up and down the farming communities. We had a Japanese Buddhist church, Japanese American Christian church, a few stores and restaurants, and those Japan towns, pretty much closed down because of what they would not be sustained as many people were dispersed. And I'll pause there and we need to continue.
Thank you. Something that Mark mentioned brought up a question I have for Sam, and that is the very common for us who are descendants of survivors to have relatives who would never speak of what happened to them. I'm wondering, Sam, how did you find your voice, and why you go to great lengths to tell this story?
Well, it turns out I wasn't interested in talking about camp until a group of lawyers contacted me. They were holding a conference, and they said, "We are looking for somebody who was in the camp who can tell what it was like. Can you talk?" I said, "Sure, I can talk." And so that's my first speech, and it was very popular. I was asked to go to many parts of the country and repeat the talk. And that's how it began. And then I went to a teachers' conference, and the teachers asked me to come to their schools and talk. And so as of today, the last 10 years, I've spoken at some 500 schools. Any one of you, if you know a school here and like to hear my story, let me know. I'd be happy to accommodate you. But a lot of people don't know what happened and why it happened, and I'm always pleased to tell everyone about that.
Okay, thank you. And Wade, can you tell me, how do you think being a survivor, or not a survivor, a descendant of a survivor, has influenced your life or shaped your life?
Well, my parents went to camp, as I say. One of the biggest things that I recall happened when I went to school. Prior to that, when starting school, one thing I didn't notice was when I started school, nobody would say, "Oh, what's going on? Why am I different from everybody else?" Not realizing that not only was I different, but I didn't realize I was speaking Japanese and English in a combination. So my grandparents lived with me, so I was speaking both. They said, "Well, no more Japanese at the house." And so that was one of the lessons learned, is that, okay, well, maybe it's the way I talk as a good understanding. Well, as it went down later on, our school was predominantly white. And as I went through school, I found the same prejudice happening throughout. There are very few minorities. There's 8 of us, believe it or not, in my class. And 8 of us would be the only ones hanging out together. All the rest would have their own groups, but we would be the one small group. I felt that kind of interesting. I got to experience what prejudice was like. I think for me, when I was having that happen, it was pretty tough to take. But now that I've been through it, I realized, you know what? I was fortunate because I got to see what prejudice is like from the other side. So now I have a vision of both sides of that. Life in school, I remember every day I would come back with a black eye, a fight. Something was bleeding because whenever I was discriminated against, rather than try and walk away from it, I go, well, no, I'm going to fight back on this one here. So if a person is going to discriminate me, downgrade me, I would make them pay for it somehow. Even if they beat me up, I still want to remember that it hurts to make fun of people. So I did do that when my father said, "What, we get fights every day. You got to do something about that." So he put me in judo, and I found that in judo, the discipline is walk away. Always walk away. If you walk away with your head up instead of your head down, you still walk away a winner. So that was one of the big lessons I learned. And the only time, believe it or not, and Debbie's going to probably hate me telling you a story, that I ended up using judo in anger was when I was an adult. My daughter was 3 years old, my son was a year old. We went to McDonald's here on Upper State Street. And the security guard came up to me, and my daughter was there looking to see what she can get. The guy pushes her out of the way. And as he pushed her out of the way, he goes, "Speak the little jab." I lost right there in that spot. I did what's called the Seiraya. I threw him on top of my head, and I walked over to the nearest trash can and clamped him right in the champ. It was like this for about 5 minutes, it seemed like, because he couldn't get out. His hands were also had 3 heat-wise to come pull him out of that trash can. And first I go, "Well, I apologize, sir," because I saw hard to see his every go. Well, hacker. And so I apologized. I went mad. We were thinking about leaving, but everybody cleared the whole area for us to sit down. A security bar, for the hour, just moved and went out the front door. So, but that was the only time I ever did it. And I felt bad about it, but at the same time, you can imagine what it's like having your daughter discriminated against just because as they see. After that, ongoing times, things have changed substantially. I think things have gotten a lot better. Believe it or not, what I see personally and witness is a change in cultural ethics and vision. A gentleman, an actor named Bruce Lee, all of a sudden he'd be a hero if you're an Asian. Whereas before that, we never had anybody that was going to create that type of law. So that was one of the biggest things. If you think about it, media has huge amounts of influence on people, on what they do. And so things like this, when we talk about it, are times where we can actually be respected and be understood for what we believe in. You hear from the other two panelists, they've been the same thing. They created a place for themselves based on experiences they've had.
I know I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, and there were really no minorities until I got into junior high, and my sister and I were the only mixed race people in Boulder, Colorado, all through high school. And I remember I had a crush on this new kid when I was in grade school, and one day I was walking home and I felt something hit the back of my leg, and it turned out he was throwing stones at me, calling me the N-word. So that was kind of interesting. And later I discovered through a woman who grew up also in Boulder, but 10 years later than I did, that there had been an active Ku Klux Klan group in Colorado. So yeah, there's definitely some painful memories, and it was a blessing to come to California, I remember, because I felt like the ugly duckling that turned into the swan, because all of a sudden, I was welcomed and felt, comfortable. I really loved living in California for that reason. Confronting racism, and you can also put a more positive light on it. I'm today really grateful to be part Japanese because of the incredible cultural legacy of Japan in art. I feel very blessed, and the newer generations are really they all want to go to Japan and learn how to draw anime or go to Tokyo. So it's like a benefit, but it wasn't that way when I was small.
Well, one specific incident is that I was attending a chess tournament that was held at a Lions Club. It was a social, charitable club, similar to Rotary and so. And this was about 1965, and so I went there, and they said, "Oh, you can't go in," but they said, "You can't go in right now. We have to check and make sure we get permission for you to go." Because this was one of the groups that refused to accept people of color attending there. So I waited there about 15 minutes and met a bunch of folk, and they said, "Fine, you're welcome to come in now." So that was just one of the experiences that I had. But the other thing is that I think people face is sort of the reverse side of the model minority. And so the pressures that people feel to be that model minority were very harsh on those who don't meet up to that standard. In Los Angeles in the 1970s, there were like 24 drug overdoses of young Japanese Americans. But none of the founders would admit that their children were using drugs. So they're all listed as dying of heart attacks and strokes at the age of 18, 20, 22. And I think, mental health is something that like other communities, is reluctant to acknowledge. And 2 of my cousins died from mental health. Died from suicide. So I think that those are issues that affect all communities, but it's within our communities as well. And I think the combination of the impact of the camps and the trauma that really made people want to show the Death Space board, that was sort of the reverse side of that.
I totally relate to that. My father, I was thought of as being just very Japanese, but I realized it was more than that. It was because he had experienced, wasn't in camp because he was in medical school in Michigan, but his family all went to camp. And I think that he, like a lot of people of his generation, really felt the need to be perfect, to be so honest, to help everybody, to work so hard. And I think that that's part of what's come down to me, too, is I realize that, there is a part of me that always feels like I have to do everything twice as well, work twice as hard just to be the same as everyone else. Does anyone else on the panel feel like they've had that experience as being, one of the generations falling?
I have a comment about what I went through. After camp, we went back to California, and we were not welcome back home. There was a lot of hate in California, and I remember there were signs that says, "Keep moving. You're no longer welcome." And so the hate was very bad. And my father figured out the only solution to this problem is to make sure that the young people get a good education so they can afford to live where they want to and not have to face neighbors who have that problem. And so in San Francisco, it turns out the best education you can get is across the bay at Berkeley. And so many of my friends and I, we all went to Berkeley, and we all got professional degrees. And it really thanks to my father, who had the foresight to figure out how to solve this problem, but not to do it directly, but indirectly make sure that the young people get a solution. And by the way, Berkeley in those days, in 1951, the tuition was very affordable, $37 a semester. So that worked out well. They couldn't afford Stanford, but they could afford Berkeley. And so a lot of us I became an engineer and worked for the Boeing company, and it worked out well. But really, thanks to my parents who figured that out.
During the course of the show, I've had many people empathize with this situation and feel like they want to somehow help or contribute to social justice. Does anyone have a recommendation of what people can do to foster peace and harmony and understanding?
What I would say, the most important thing, I found this through working through Rotary International. I visited over 200 countries for Rotary doing projects around the world. I'll tell you this, 2 of the places I was most welcome, believe it or not. Number 2 was Haiti. They invited Haiti, believe it or not, of all the places where they have all of the social and political unrest. They actually gave me an award. I was given a full-size Haitian flag by a representative of the United Nations. I go, what is this for? He goes, this is for doing the work that you have done in Haiti. We want to honor you and make you an honorary member or citizen of Haiti. You are welcome anytime by the diplomacy of this group. That was the first one. The second one I did, believe it or not, was in Guatemala. And in Guatemala, I did a project there in a village, the Mayan Hachi village, about 24,000 people. I looked at that area for 5 days, evaluating projects there. This is one place in the world that I went to where every single person, I'm talking every person that lived in that city, was a smile. They have told strangers that walk up to you and eating dinner, go, enjoy your dinner, enjoy your meal. You would walk by them on the streets. They would wave at you. They would drive by you on cars at Hop Travar and wave at you hello. I had never seen that anyone in the world. I bring this up because this one group, the Mayanarchi people, are extremely resilient. In the 1980s, during the Cold War, the Mayanarchi people had 5,000 of their people killed by military Guatemalans that were backed by the United States government. You never hear that. If you look in the history books, you never see that in there. But I put that out there because even though they had this type of discrimination, lost 2 generations of their equal, they were able to come back and still smile at everybody every day because of the fact that they found it was better to be friends with everybody than to be enemies. You're not spying on anybody, you're bringing that forward. Respect comes from the way you treat other people. I think that was the one of us I learned working internationally. I feel that's how we are going to get past this today. People that recognize it, see an appreciation for how people are being discriminated against. The first thing I'll say is, why? Why is that happening? We should be friends. We should become people of all the same area working for the same cause. I did a peace conference, and the keynote speaker said, you know what? Discrimination all starts because you have a lack of respect for the other person. You change that by creating more respect for them and acceptance. I said, you are completely wrong. You missed the boat by a mile. It is not acceptance. It's appreciation. Appreciation of our differences. And I think that is going to be the number one thing that will get us back and beyond this. Thanks.
I think the thing that can be done is look for groups that you're in sympathy with and get to know them. And then come sort of exchange what you're doing and then find out what kinds of things they would use would be upheld. So, for example, in our work with Muslim communities, we were asked to, they were having a children's fair at a Muslim school. And so we ended up doing an origami table for the children there and taught them, origami. On another occasion, we're by a large detention center, and during COVID, all of a sudden they released a lot of detainees. And they said, you have old suitcases, because our people are going all over the place. They need suitcases. So we asked the Japanese American community, Los Angeles, if you have old suitcases, we'll come pick them up. And so we did that. So we have those, the other things that we've done with, so we've done those kind of things. And with the Muslims, they have, during the Ramadan holidays, they fast during the day and then they eat at night and they eat after sunset. And so we did joint ventures, but those are typed when groups go and join and share the breaking and the fast as a way of showing solidarity. So there's just different things. Sometimes it's supporting them in legislative issues that come up, but it means first starting to get to know them and finding out ways that are good for what you and your friends might want to do, as well as what's helpful for them.
I'm going to allow each of our speakers a little time if you have anything that you didn't get to touch upon that you wanted to speak about.
Well, nothing that I haven't hit on earlier as far as why it happened, but another thing that we should all remember is can it happen again to other people? And I simply say it almost happened right after 9/11 when people were saying maybe it's time to remove Muslim Americans like we did the Japanese during World War II. And if it wasn't for President Bush, we would have maybe another problem. So I really believe it could happen again, and the solution, which I teach to all the schools, and that is when one becomes old enough to vote, make sure that the candidate believes in the Constitution, because the Constitution guarantees liberty and due process. So if you have liberty and due process, we would have never gone to camp. And if the leader believes in that, that will never happen again. So be sure to select future leaders based on their belief in the Constitution. So I think that's a very important point for young people to remember.
For me, I would say if you take a look at that time, that era in history, we're looking at between 110 to 120,000 people that were displaced, taken to camp. And those are only ones that are direct. There are also some of those that were sent back to Japan. My grandparents, our roots came back where they moved here in 1890s, 1900s. They were from Hiroshima. And if you look at that same war, that same time, 110 to 150,000 people were killed during the atomic bombs that time. So you look at the disasters of putting those two points together, you have close to, believe it or not, 500,000 people of Japanese descent that were affected during World War II. That's huge. And if you think about how resilient those populations became, if you look at Japan, where that stands in the world economy and the technologies and progress that they've made, if you look at the Japanese Americans here, you'll find that the resiliency is there. More hardships that these people receive, it seemed like the greater the successes were based on that. But because of the focus, I remember as a child, my father says, you only get respect if you're the top of your class. You only get respect if you are, quote, the champion or doing the best you can do. So he says, if you want to gain respect, that is how you do it. So that's why Japanese culture and Japanese Americans are so, I would say, successful. They've been told that in order to get respect, you have to be successful in what you do. The last part, this is an interesting argument, which I wanted to share with you. I served on city council. When I was serving on city council, one of the times we had the district, but they said, you know what, we have an underserved percentage of your population. Carpinteria is about 50%, almost 50% Hispanic. Again, we had no Hispanics on council at that time, and we had no women. So they said, there's a problem here. You have 100% majority. I looked around and go, 100%? I go, well, then we're elected on this one if you're trying to get a minority quota. And the gentleman told me, by the way, he was suing the city for $25,000. He goes, Wade, you don't count because you're Japanese American. You don't show up on the charts. You're a super minority. So we love you as a majority. I go, well, that's pretty weak. But you know what? I don't want to cost the city $25,000, so I just went along with it. Those are instances where people are fighting, but they're fighting for the wrong reason. That was for a fight for $25,000, not for a balance of representation. So keep an eye on that. What your success is going to be from having a balance. People will be in positions of decision making based on their abilities, their knowledges, and that has nothing to do with their ethnicities. I think that is what we have to get to be successful.
Sometimes, and not from people here, but sometimes we've heard that Japanese Americans would say, we went to camp and nobody helped us. And while it's true that, we didn't get a lot of help, but there were significant instances when others, particularly white Christian groups like the Quaker, like the United Church of Christ, where people did help us. They brought things, gifts and donations to people who were serving in camp. They did other things to help Japanese Americans leave camp early or to college, things like that. And there were other groups like the ACLU who actually helped in some of the lawsuits. They were fighting the incarceration laws. So I just think that even though it may, and a lot of times these things are not mentioned, unfortunately. And I think we should respect it when those instances occurred and celebrate them and make sure that, these things happen and ordinary, regular people can do them.
We failed to mention this one. That has to do with our reparations. On August 10th, 1988, Ronald Reagan declared that there was a misunderstanding, a mistrust, and so the redress program was put in place. Every surviving member that had been put into one of the camps was given $20,000 reparation. $20,000, but you had to be survived. My father passed away on, believe it or not, July 28th, 1988. So he received nothing. My mother did get the money. I go, well, what are you going to do after you get $20,000? She goes, could I tear up that check? I don't want. Because she goes, let's just say that they're sorry, but she goes, it also is going to bring back that same memory of people then discriminating us all over again because we were taking government funds. So she goes, I want to have nothing to do with it. So we actually talked her in, hey, do you want to keep it and passing it down to the next generation? So you will hear about the reparation, but you think about it, from 1945 to 1988 at $20,000 was fairly modest, as I say at least, but it was an acknowledgement that it didn't just was. So I did want to share that to you because if you ever hear about that or read about it, again, it was a gesture use.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for our question and answer. Yes.
The main point of the question was, what was a quote no-no that we've been during the camp times? It was a designation because of a questionnaire that the U.S. government put out there. Two of the questions, 26 and 27, asked if you would have allegiance to the United States and exclude any allegiance to Japan at that time. I think that was one, and there's a second one. I will give this to Sam because he was actually one of those that had to fill out that questionnaire.
Yeah, the other question was, would you be willing to serve in the military if you were asked? And if you answered yes, you're okay. But if you answered no, that's the no. And therefore you're labeled a no. If you answered one or both with a no. But my father, by the way, he was well educated in English in Japan. And he said, I cannot answer this question. I have a copy of his original questionnaire, and he said, I cannot answer because I already said when I immigrated through U.S., at that time I gave up my allegiance to Japan. And I don't know if you all are aware, but every immigrant today still has to not add allegiance to the prior country. They have to have allegiance to the U.S. So technically it's impossible for anyone to say, I am no longer allegiance to the former country, because they don't have a former country. They only had the U.S. That was something my father left with me. I have a copy of his questionnaire. It's very interesting.
And then the other question actually had to do with serving for the U.S. And many people didn't sign that one, and they put down no there also because they thought they were going to be the first one to go back to Japan because they were interpreters. They would understand the language and the culture. So would they be set there as spies or assassins? So they said, no, we're not going to do that either. So that was the two no and no's.
And note that when they're labeled no, they were sent to Tule Lake, which was the camp in Northern California, a very strict camp under harsh conditions.
And by the way, here are about 150 of them also that disappeared completely. Ended up in federal penitentiaries. Of those, 50% were accounting for the other 50%. According to rumor, their use is test guinea pigs for some experience. But most of them, by the way, they were bachelors or sale. Most of them.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie Nakagana, and I was wondering if you could address the issue of ICE and what we need to do to make sure that what happened to the Japanese Americans do not happen to the people that ICE is going after today, although a lot of them are already in detention camps that have been murdered.
I think that there's a lot of pro-immigrant rights groups all over, and I think they're online as well as you could visit them in person. Given that these are all done by the federal government, there's lots of forms in which people are supporting. One is the detention centers, and there are ones in the area people can visit this and just express support. And it's a little complicated process, but we regularly go make visits so that they feel the support from people who, because they don't get any other visitors. So that's an important step. And there's just other things that if you find a group that's doing this kind of support work, just join into those kind of activities. And then, of course, there's the whole electoral arena, and that's another field.
Can you just briefly describe Nikkei Progressives and what they did?
Okay, so I'm part of a group, a multi-generational, all volunteer group in Los Angeles, and the group was involved in an earlier form in the Japanese American redress and reparations movement. But after that victory was won, we continued to do support work for other communities, as well as addressing continuing issues within the Japanese American community. And so it's been a host of things, and we've supported, for example, the comfort women, of other Asian countries whose whose women were, used as were used as sex slaves for the Japanese army, and they're trying to get reparations from the Japanese government. We work on a whole. I'm getting off the subject, but I just think that those are steps that we're taking, and some are easier to do. I don't go around driving, doing surveillance of Home Depots like other groups, like other people are doing. But there's things that change depending on what ICE is actually doing at a particular times.
I'd like to add something, and that is that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I'm really grateful to the museum for hosting my exhibit, which I think has been timely in this regard, and much appreciated. I think the audiences that have come through. And one of the things that you can do, because there's not many museums and galleries that will show this kind of work because they are afraid of the current administration. And this museum has been around for 40-something years, but only 3 years in this iteration. So big museums, they have their, endowments and they have their donor lists and stuff. This small, group of people that are running the museum now could use financial support. So if you are able to, if you see Michelle at the front and can give a donation of some sort, it will help this museum continue to have this kind of programming, which I think is important because art does have a different kind of voice, but it does have a powerful voice and a way of connecting with people.
Hi, I'm Lauren. Both my grandparents were interned in Arizona, in Gila River, and then Poston too. What do you want younger generation, myself and them, to understand most about this chapter in history?
I would say the important part of that one is how isolated it is in history. What happened there is unique, believe it or not, to American history. Having an awareness and an understanding will bring that to future generations by eliminating that from our history books, eliminating that from other lessons learned. I think it's an important part that we include that throughout. One of the big things the Japanese American community is doing is to restore some of these camps, the internment camps, back to what they looked like before. They're all historical. We have many different displays throughout the West Coast, actually even to the East Coast, about those times specific. So I would encourage everybody to include that in history, to talk about it, bring in people like this that are either survivors or have awareness of what's happened. That's the only way it's going to continue to be active in resisting any type of change or this going back again.
It sounds like you have some ideas. Could you answer your own questions?
I guess similar to what you shared, it's exposure, it is sharing, it is storytelling. And so the way that Keith fell asleep, but the way I explained to them was, we are going to go hear some stories about people who had experiences that are different than the experiences that you were having today as a kid. But we're going to understand what was like in different periods of time. And so I think sharing in a way that is understandable is how I'm trying to break and share.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for coming. And as a little act of self-promotion, you could take my business card and sign up for my newsletter that goes out 2 or 3 times a year if you like. I have a show opening in Los Angeles, October 24th, of Japanese-style gold screens. And I'd love to hear from you. I thank you so much, and I'd thank our panelists, some of them like Sam, who came all the way from Huntington Beach. It's really been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy lives to come and speak with us. Thank you.